artist from Ethiopia, Miheret Kebede. I think we're going to hear from her, and then we're going to hear her beautiful art. Miheret?
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm really happy to be part of this amazing program that we need, such kind of program in more and more. So I'll just shortly go to the piece. That's going to be played next. This is a collaborative performance art piece that I did with US-based choreographers, Wei Wilcox and Noel Awadillah. So this poem is dedicated to all individuals and groups marginalized because of who they are in the name of culture and social hegemonic beliefs or discourses. It is an art piece made for those who feel in exile while being in the space they call home. It is presented in Amharic and English languages, intertwined to each other, to be heard and experienced in spoken word and choreography. So you'll be able to hear the English and Amharic texts being evolved to each other around the common concept with different expressions, emotions, and intonations. So I'll just go straight to the piece. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much.
Exile. ስደተኛ ቅኔ. A personal lament, a collective grief. Space is shapeless. A place is a fiction. And a fiction is a fact. Sadly. With a thought you triumph. In a battle you don't take part. In a solely grief. Geography is just a graph. ቦታ ቅርጽ የለውም። ስፍራም ልብ ወለድ ነው። በባከነ ሐሳብ ባልዘመቱበት ድል በብቻ ቁዘማ በብቻ ድልድል ሀገር ካርታ ብቻ ካርታም ያው ምስቅልቅል የሐሳብ መስመር ላይ ሐሳብን የሚጥል I am an exile. ባይተዋር ነኝ እኔ ባይተዋር ነኝ እኔ ግዞተኛ ቅኔ Space is shapeless. A thought is spaceless. In an affair I roar. In a plot I matter. In a play I function. I am an exile. On the verge of the river, a thirsty fish in the water. In a short distance, in a breath away, a breathless dense air. I am in exile. ባይተዋር ነኝ እኔ ግዞተኛ ቅኔ በገዛ መንደሬ ተሸለምኩ መጥኔ ትንፋሽ እያጋራሁ ትንፋሽ ያጣው ቅኔ እያለሁ የለሁም አልታያችሁም አልታያችሁም With a brace that bind us with a scarce hope to come in a short distance in a nearby vicinity I am in exile. I am in exile. Can't you see me? እያለሁ የለሁም አልታያችሁም I am in exile in my own city. In my own city. ባይተዋር ነኝ እኔ በገዛ ሀገሬ በገዛ መንደሬ ስደተኛ ቅኔ A sibling to my dream, a stranger to a brother. A distance between us is a distance among us. Your lineage is a misconnect. My thought line is inadequate. Before I expelled, I am a misplaced I am a misplayed. Can't you see me? አልታያችሁም? ለቤቴ እንግዳ ለወንድሜ ባዳ ከስደቴ በፊት የተሰደድኩ እኔ ቦታዬ ላይ ሆኜ ቦታ ያጣ ቅኔ ሀገሬ ላይ ሆኜ ህብር አልባ ቅኔ ግዞተኛ ቅኔ I am in exile. I am in exile. ባይተዋር ነኝ እኔ ስደተኛ ቅኔ On the verge of the river, a thirsty fish in the water, in a short distance and a breath away. In my own city! In my own city! ባይተዋር ነኝ እኔ በገዛ ሀገሬ በገዛ መንደሬ ስደተኛ ቅኔ ለወንድሜ እንግዳ ለወንድሜ ባዳ ለቤቴ እንግዳ ቦታ ቅርጽ የለውም ስፍራም ልቦለድ ነው በባከነ ሐሳብ ባልዘመቱበት ድል በብቻ ቁዘማ በብቻ ድልድል ሀገር ካርታ ብቻ ካርታም ያው ምስቅልቅል የሐሳብ መስመር ላይ ሐሳብን የሚጥል I am in exile. I am in exile, can't you see me? በገዛ መንደሬ የተሸለምኩ መጥኔ ትንፋሽ እያጋራው ትንፋሽ ያጣው ቅኔ እያለው የለሁም አልታያችሁም I am in exile. I am in exile.
Thank you so much. That was evocative. Miheret, do you want to say a bit more about the piece?
No, I mean, most of my artworks are collaborative and also very close to the people than the power. And I love working in collaboration with also not only local artists, also international artists, because I believe that usually it is the politicians who are meeting in whatever the festival or whatever the meeting or summit they have. So we've never, I believe that we have never made. So the people never made. So art is a very important, tool to connect all of us and to that has a power to create a space for us to have a conversation like this. So that's my main point. So so I always create some kind of connection or a space where we could be able to speak to each other. I don't think we really know each other. So it's through our politicians, when we talk about each other's country or any information. So it's what's being there written or according to those mainstream medias. So this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Meret. And thank you for reminding us of the power of words, different kinds of words, music, creativity, to make our point. Sometimes we get caught up, I suppose, in the terminologies, in the very dry academic or even dry sort of activist work without the reminder that there is so much beauty and so many multilinear ways in which we can make our points and connect. So thank you for your gift and for sharing it with us.
Thank you very much for giving me this chance to share.
Thank you. So I'd like to now introduce these fab feminists who are kind enough to join this wonderful gathering today. The first, I'm going to introduce everybody and then begin to ask each person to make inputs. So in alphabetical order, our first speaker is going to be Anna Abelenda. who's a Latinx feminist activist, a social anthropologist based in Uruguay. She also co-leads the AWID program, Building Feminist Economies, focusing on transforming mainstream economic narratives from a feminist perspective and bridging the knowledge gap, very importantly, around tax and gender justice. She facilitates workshops on challenging corporate power and combating illicit financial flows as feminist issues, and currently focuses on strengthening dialogue on alternative models of organizing life and beyond economies from a feminist perspective. Anita Naya is a director of Regions Refocus, which builds cross-regional, cross-movement solidarity in the struggle for progressive and feminist economic policy, and serves as the co-chair of the Gender and Trade Coalition. Anita has worked nationally and internationally on economic globalization and ecological justice. She previously served as chief of the UN Non-Governmental Liaison Service in New York and on the executive committee of another wonderful movement, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, otherwise known as DAWN. Next, we have Crystal Simeoni, who serves as the NAWI director, which is a new formation. She has about 10 years experience working on macro level inequalities and works on women's rights and macroeconomic policy at all levels, regional, global, managing and curating spaces and processes, including advocacy and policy advocacy work, enabling Pan-African feminists to influence policy at continental and at global levels. And she says she is a champion for women at all levels to be able to influence macroeconomic policy decision-making. Fatima Keller is a Pan-African feminist technical advisor and strategist engaged in feminist advocacy, research, and advice. Fatima has worked primarily on African transformational trajectories with a focus on challenging economic and other development orthodoxies in particular. And Flora Patenio is a feminist and lesbian activist from Argentina. She holds a PhD in social sciences from the University of Buenos Aires. She is a professor at public universities in Argentina, and she is a member of DAWN's executive committee and the coordinator of the School of Feminist Economics. And I'd like to welcome all of you wonderful women to our conversation. And thank you for gifting us with your time, with your ideas, with your creativity, and the generosity to birth this wonderful festival with us. I'd like to turn the conversation firstly over to Anna. And basically the thrust of this is globalization and corporate power. Understanding, of course, that the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions were originally the locus of corporate power in ways that are unexpected. They were originally actually supposed to be about people loving people, right? And people, the whole world and nations being equal in many ways and democratized, and a democratized view of world politics and global power. And over the last few years and last half century at least, they've almost become proxies for reinforcing internationalism in a very toxic way, in ways that often reinforce colonial constructs, but they've also come to be a place where economic inequalities and inequities are reenacted and reinscripted. So they become the bastions in many respects of globalization. I think moving from there, it would be really wonderful to hear more around the global challenges of globalization as it keeps resurfacing, as it keeps reforming. Devaki Jayan yesterday reminded us of the imperialism of vocabulary and the ways in which things often remain the same, even though the wording and the languaging is a moving target or are a moving target. And what does development mean in the context of the Global South, international organizations, and corporatization of development? These are some of the issues that I'm hoping, and I know that our wonderful panel here are going to address themselves too. And I'd like to invite Anna in about 10 minutes to kick us off in this conversation. The floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you, Lepahang, and gracias a todo el mundo. I will speak in Spanish, voy a hablar en español en esta oportunidad, así que les doy un tiempito para cambiar hacia las intérpretes. Primero decir muchas gracias por la invitación para ser parte del festival y de esta sesión en particular, y por una introducción tan enormemente bella, con un poema, y bueno, el uso de las artistas feministas es realmente importante también dentro de nuestras luchas. Quería centrarme en mi intervención de 10 minutos en algunos puntos que me parecen importantes sobre qué es lo nuevo y lo viejo del poder corporativo y cómo desde los movimientos feministas nos estamos posicionando no solo para resistir, sino también para desafiar el avance del poder de las grandes corporaciones en distintos ámbitos, en particular aquellos que deciden la macroeconomía y la política internacional como lineamientos a seguir a nivel local. Una de las primeras cosas que me parece importante es definir qué entendemos por poder corporativo, porque EWID viene haciendo desde el 2016 un trabajo muy importante con distintas alianzas de los movimientos feministas y los movimientos de los sindicatos. Un poder para tratar de definir qué es exactamente lo que entendemos por poder corporativo. Y lo definimos como el control excesivo y la apropiación de los recursos naturales, del trabajo, de la información y las finanzas, por una alianza de corporaciones muy poderosas que no operan solas, sino que operan también en conjunto con las élites globales y con gobiernos que también son funcionales a ese poder. Cuando decimos que hay una captura del poder corporativo, hablamos de una influencia que es creciente en el liderazgo de las grandes empresas y las empresas transnacionales, en particular, en las áreas de política pública a nivel a nivel global. Claramente vemos un avance del poder corporativo dentro de las Naciones Unidas, en sus diversas agencias, y también a nivel local, teniendo un impacto muy duro sobre los derechos humanos y los derechos de las mujeres en particular. Es importante, como decía Lebohang, y también escuché en el panel de ayer con Devaki Jain, contextualizar el poder corporativo como un proceso histórico que va unido con la expansión del capitalismo y tiene a su vez raíces muy profundas en el colonialismo, en el imperialismo, y que se refuerza de las ideas de lo ideológico dentro de la supremacía blanca y el patriarcado. Hay diversas formas en las que eso se hace evidente. Si vemos además el poder económico que tienen algunas de estas compañías, podemos ver, por ejemplo, que muchas de ellas tienen un PBI mayor al de muchos países. Por ejemplo, los activos de Walmart tienen un poder mayor al del PBI de España y de Australia, por ejemplo. Y de hecho, sabemos que el 63% de las 175 mayores entidades económicas son corporaciones transnacionales y no países. Entonces, estamos hablando de un poder económico enorme. Y además, si tenemos en cuenta, como también ha evaluado la UNCTAD, que el 80% del comercio internacional, de hecho, sucede dentro de las cadenas de valor de las propias empresas transnacionales. Entonces, eso es muy importante saber como datos fríos sobre a qué clase de poder económico nos estamos enfrentando. Hay algo que también ha evolucionado y que quizás es una forma nueva de capturar poder, que es el rol que han tenido las grandes corporaciones en el apoyo a lo que llamamos actores antiderechos, que consolidan justamente agendas conservadoras, que son antiderechos humanos y también que están haciendo muy mal al planeta y los derechos medioambientales. Solo por citar algunos ejemplos, que he escuchado ayer, y también una de las primeras compañías transnacionales que existieron fue como la East India Company, que estaban ligadas al poder colonial, y una de las primeras actividades económicas transnacionales fue justamente el tráfico de personas esclavas hacia lugares nuevamente colonizados para la explotación de los recursos. En particular de donde soy, de mi región, América Latina, la historia colonial y neocolonial se sigue repitiendo, y las grandes corporaciones transnacionales tienen un peso enorme en la decisión económica y en el devenir de las comunidades de esta región y de otras también. Otro ejemplo que estamos viendo bastante preocupante, que ayer mencionabas, Leboham, tiene que ver con el colonialismo de las farmacéuticas también, que dado el contexto con el COVID es extremadamente preocupante. Y de hecho, las listas del Financial Times ya dejan ver, por ejemplo, que muchas de las compañías farmacéuticas han tenido un auge en sus acciones y en sus beneficios a raíz de esta pandemia, y que además están poniendo en riesgo derechos tan básicos como el acceso a la salud y el acceso a, sobre todo, comunidades del sur, de poder acceder a los productos y medicamentos, no solamente la vacuna, sino el acceso a los test, siendo además que estas compañías utilizan los mecanismos de propiedad intelectual para sacar sus dividendos. En este sentido hay campañas de los movimientos feministas para lograr frenar este avance del poder corporativo, para lograr que la salud sea un derecho para todos, para todas y todos, y en este sentido poder frenar dentro de la OMC la idea de avanzar con la propiedad intelectual dentro de el contexto del COVID. También es importante ver que también es algo que vemos como un problema creciente que se manifiesta de diversas maneras, el creciente lobby de las empresas transnacionales a nivel público e internacional. Una de los actores más interesantes para ver esta evolución en ese sentido es la Cámara Internacional del Comercio, por ejemplo, que es un grupo lobby basado en París, que tiene 45 millones, representa a muchísimas transnacionales, y una de sus áreas más interesantes de influencia ha sido las negociaciones sobre el cambio climático, logrando tener un estado de observador dentro de la Convención de Cambio Climático de Naciones Unidas, lo cual llama poderosamente la atención porque es una organización que está liderada por las mayores empresas contaminantes del mundo, como BP Group, como Shell y como ExxonMobil. Vemos con muchísima preocupación este avance del poder corporativo a través particularmente de la Cámara Internacional del Comercio, que también, por ejemplo, está liderando ahora esfuerzos del sector privado dentro de Naciones Unidas. También existe una preocupación que quizás es más ideológica, pero es efectiva, de cómo están permeando las narrativas neoliberales para el poder económico, que tienen que ver en particular con las políticas fiscales y las formas neocoloniales de apropiación de recursos financieros del sur global. EWID es parte de la Tax Justice Network, de la Red Global por la Justicia Fiscal, que ha sacado este año, hace muy poquito, un informe súper interesante que recomiendo leer sobre el nivel de evasión fiscal de las grandes corporaciones, donde más o menos está costando desde 419 mil millones de dólares que se pierden por año, en particular en los países de renta baja del sur. Estos recursos son recursos que se filtran, se drenan en lo que llamamos flujos financieros ilícitos, que también ha investigado mucho desde la perspectiva feminista, que son recursos que son un drenaje para las arcas públicas, y en particular todo lo que tiene que ver con los servicios públicos, la educación, la salud, el acceso a una seguridad social. Es un impacto tremendo de la evasión fiscal en los países del sur, y que además es muestra de un avance del lobby de las grandes corporaciones dentro de quienes deciden políticas públicas. Quiero dejar también como mensaje, ya que se me va el tiempo, de qué estamos haciendo de los movimientos feministas para frenar el avance de las corporaciones internacionales, del poder corporativo. Me parece que una de las áreas fundamentales a nivel internacional tiene que ver con buscar mayores mecanismos para la responsabilidad, para el accountability, que no sean solamente voluntarios y se basen en la responsabilidad social, sino que estén ancladas en un marco de derechos humanos, y para eso hay un grupo de organizaciones y redes feministas que están impulsando un tratado vinculante en materia de derechos humanos y transnacionales. También a nivel local, el trabajo que hacen las organizaciones y las mujeres defensoras de derechos humanos en parar distintas iniciativas desde América Latina. Bueno, el caso de Berta Cáceres hace varios años fue paradigmático, porque además esto se hace a un costo altísimo en la vida de las mujeres defensoras y sus comunidades. Y también pensar otras narrativas que no sean las neoliberales y basadas en el empoderamiento, que me parece fundamental y tiene que ver con esto que decías tú, de Bohan, sobre el colonialismo, digamos, de las palabras, el imperialismo en las palabras que usamos, que es muy claro que las grandes corporaciones han cooptado nuestro lenguaje, sobre todo aquel que habla del empoderamiento económico, para hacerlo algo que está en función del mercado, que habla de un individualismo empresarial y mucho menos de un esfuerzo comunitario por hacer otras economías feministas posibles. Y dejo por aquí. Gracias.
Thank you, Anna. That was a really fantastic, smashing launch into this. I think that there's a lot to be said around the capturing of language, the capturing of corporate power, and even the capturing of states. Many of us are probably aware that in South Africa, it's a national sport to talk about state capture. But I think that state capture is not only political, but it's also economic. It goes to the fundamentals of the levers of power and economics, the disbursement and the distribution of influence across the economy in different ways. And I thank you for bringing that to our attention. And of course, bringing to our attention the tax injustice, basically the capital flight that is dressed up as tax evasion, deeply illegal, deeply problematic, and yet as citizens, as individuals, we are taxed far more highly, proportional to international corporations. And one of the ways that, of course, the beauty contest of looking for investors is that, especially countries in the global south, is to immediately offer tax holidays. Absolutely ridiculous. So thank you so much, Anna, for that. I'm going to call on Comrade Anita to give us her remarks. Anita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Levahang, and thank you to all of my fellow panelists, and to those who are joining us. It's really precious to be part of a moment called a festival to think creatively and to really re-energize ourselves as we sit in these very sort of socially distanced or physically distanced spaces. So I'd like to speak to three constructs that I think frame corporate power and our struggle to confront it. And the three are capitalism, power imbalances, and imperialism. So around capitalism, I think it's important that we take as a starting point an understanding that we live in a capitalist world order. And central to this order is private enterprise. So whether they are small, medium, or large, it is this form, this legal form, which is essential to the capitalist order. And it's from that form of the enterprise that it seeks to influence public policy. So the larger the form, the more it influences. And the largest form of the enterprise is the corporation. And that's the focus of our conversation today. So it's important to understand that the interests of corporations, which is maximizing profit by minimizing regulation and taxes at the expense of workers and public goods, are really fundamentally opposed to the interests of the working classes. So while we need to envision an alternative economic system to capitalism at large, and one that protects the rights of people and the health of the planet and so on, a critical first step to this, and again, the focus of our conversation today, is really challenging the power of corporations over our public economic and social systems. So the second point of the power imbalances then. So if we speak about corporations capturing public policy spaces through legal, financial, the institutional governance architectures, in turn, the working classes, whether they are women, peasants, farmers, etc., are increasingly excluded from influencing these governance spaces. So in the contestation of powers, between the enterprise and workers, how do we ensure that the balance of power favors workers? I feel we have to generate as much pressure on governments as the companies do, and to take up the political fight to reduce their influence over policy by holding them accountable to serve the public good. Now, that's a complex picture of how to do that, but obviously exposing companies if there's a conflict of interest, or if they're doing things against the law or the constitution, if they're, obviously they can't pay the salaries of government officials, or that we need to push them, as we were saying earlier, to ensure that governments exact a fair share of taxes from the corporations, which is a very large sum of money and necessary to pay for public goods, and not allow the companies to get away with corporate social responsibility because those kinds of investments are not publicly available to all. How do we ensure democratizing large corporations to give workers an ownership stake and more decision-making power? I think it's also involves challenging the policy elite, which in fact comes from enterprise. So recognizing fundamentally that, behaving as good citizens is not in their nature, and the steps that they may have taken towards serving any public interest are always under severe pressure from social forces, including working classes. So that brings me to the third point around imperialism, because we need to recognize that the corporations of Nigeria or India and so on are not as powerful as those in America. And if a South country, for example, kicks out a Walmart, let's say, their next IMF loan will not be approved. So the modern multinational corporation is operating in a very unequal balance of power of the global political economy. So multinational corporations in the North, cannot only mobilize their capital of their own capital, but also of their states and of the multilateral institutions in which they wield undue power, including the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and even at the United Nations, which makes corporations in the North far more powerful than in the South. And the collusion of this massive scale between governments and transnational corporations, and the collusion between governments and national corporate elites is really evident in what we've been monitoring as the ongoing negotiations for a post-Cotonou agreement between the European Union and 78 of the most vulnerable states across the global South, across Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And really, this agreement is a re-articulation of the colonial relationships. The European Union has been attempting to gain what's called undistorted access to the extractive sectors, investment-friendly tax systems, etc. Why? To serve the interests of their companies. So as we know, extractive sectors are dominated by unregulated foreign capital with free rein to disrupt livelihoods and destroy ecological systems, and really siphon profits out of South economies. And this kind of outflow of wealth is further aggravated by the kind of tax evasion and illicit financial practices that Anna spoke to. And it's really replicated outside extractive industries to agriculture, to finance sector, to services, and so on. So I think the consequences of this imperialist power are really being felt through enforced free trade and the co-optation and the corruption, if you want, of governments that are supposed to be ensuring people's rights against these kinds of abuses. So I think with the kind of rampant neoliberal and financial globalization, without checks and balances, multinational corporations are really freed up to do pretty much what they please in relation to production and trade without much or any regulation at all. And so we see this very sharply in bilateral and regional trade agreements. And these are sort of attempts to free up transnational corporations from regulation and accountability. And I think challenging these kinds of power imbalances and imperialist forces really requires solidarity between movements and working classes across the South and with allies in the North. And I would say that the Gender and Trade Coalition is one such feminist site of struggle to really dismantle corporate power, particularly in trade policy, which really affects every aspect of our lives. And I would just invite all of you who are on this session with us to join this struggle. And I hope we also in turn join each other's struggles that are being shared on this call. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anita. And thanks also for mentioning the Gender and Trade Coalition, which is a very important site of struggle, as you rightly say, around corporate power and resisting corporate power. Thank you also for reminding us of the, again, reinforcing the imperial nature of corporate hegemony and the ways in which corporates have sometimes become more important and more influential than states. It's incredibly difficult, in my view, to be a leader who is progressive, who is courageous, and who is ethical in the global South right now, which is why you have apparitions like the leaders who have emerged in Brazil and others who are basically seem to be agents of Northern imperial, white, hegemonic economic and political forces. And I think that what you raise around the ways in which corporate power is able to mobilize the very same international institutions which are supposed to be democratized is testimony to the extent to which they have become or are, in fact, extensions of colonial forms of power relations and power arbitration. So thank you, Anita, for taking us there. I'd like to call next on Crystal to give your remarks. Crystal, take the floor.
Thank you. I sometimes can tend to speak a bit fast, and so I'm cognizant there's translation. If I do, please wave me down. It's so hard to speak with such amazing people. It's sort of, I just want to listen. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be on this panel with such great minds that I join in the fight and in the trenches of the fight that we all fight in different spaces. And I really want to recognize Miret, who shared her art with us, and really reminds me of the power of words and the question of narrative. And so I think about this a lot, and there's been conversation with the past two panelists on, corruption and tax. And when you look at the continent of Africa, we lose about 100 billion, in a conservative figure, $100 billion annually through illicit financial flows. And when you break that down, 65% of that amount is through commercial activities. It's multinationals on our continent, in the extractive sector mostly, that are finding loopholes in our tax frameworks, in our legislation, in our policies to shift their profits away from us. But there's this constant narrative that we don't have enough money because we have leaders that are corrupt, and so we're not able to fulfill a social contract between state and citizen. And yes, we do have quite a number of corrupt politicians and leaders on our continent. However, the numbers do speak loudly, and only 5% of the $100 billion that leaves the continent through illicit financial flows is through corruption, and begins to, begs questions around what the narrative is and what the global narrative is about us, and that we continue to believe about ourselves. And if you look at the map of the most corrupt countries, most of them will be in the global south. If you look at the map of tax havens, it's the inverse, and they will be in the global north. The amounts of money that we're talking about are completely different. The amounts of money with regard to corruption, with a 5%, is such a minuscule amount as compared to the billions that are stashed away in tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions in the global north. And so we question, when we talk about corruption, what does it really mean, and whether we should be talking about theft and really calling out what this theft is and who are the real thieves of our continent. And so then I like to go into the idea of, and this has come up, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And this whole neoliberal, neocolonial, very patriarchal system that our world exists in. And we all know that the neoliberal model needs something to subsidize it, whether it's women's labor or Black bodies. There's always something that is giving up something for the system to exist, and for a small percentage of a global population to thrive. 6 of the richest men happen to be, none of them happen to be from the continent. So even within the inequalities, there are inequalities within the inequalities. And we've moved from what we all know as the Washington Consensus to what a number of academics are now calling the Wall Street Consensus. And this is really the rise of the private sector and private finance, and the financialization of every single aspect of our lives, from healthcare to education to water access. And you can see the insidiousness with which private sector is entering the spaces that we fight in. When all of us are in the halls of the UN in New York, at the CSW or the World Bank annual meetings, the influx of private sector is continuously growing, and really we feel it in such a heavy way, and we feel ourselves constantly being edged out by these men and women in blue suits and having this very corporate approach to life and development. And so the question of narrative, when we talk about development, are we really talking about the same thing? And just to show how insidious it is, there's a new United Nations arm, and they're called the United Nations Capital Development Fund. And their website says they're making public and private finance work for the poor. And it's curious to know that the UNCDF sits in the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition of the Beijing Plus 25 process, along with the OECD that sets frameworks for global tax regulation. And so it tells a story of an imbalance of economic governance power. It tells a story of who holds the strings and the purse strings, because at the end of the day, macroeconomic policy is really about who gets to say how revenue is collected and from who, and how equitably the very same revenue is distributed. And this can be done at global spaces, at global levels, at regional levels, at local and national levels, and definitely at local levels. And so with this narrative of private finance being central to how we're continuing to develop, in comes the World Bank with a framework that they're calling a maximizing finance for development framework. And really what it is it's telling us, well, from the Financing for Development meeting in 2015, you have two options to deliver on your developmental targets, especially with regard to the SDGs. The first is domestic resource mobilization. That's not going very well because we have $100 billion leaving the continent. Tax holidays being given primarily to multinationals that are bleeding us dry. It never really looks at local investors or local private sector. It will always be to the advantage of foreign companies. The other stream that we are been asked to look at is private finance. And so the World Bank really focuses on this private finance as a focus and an opening that we're able as global South countries to develop our countries and provide for our citizens. And what it basically does is say, well, are you able to provide healthcare, for example, to your citizens? And it looks like you're having a bit of a rough time. And so, enter private finance. We've got the perfect partner, private sector partner that can come in under what they call public-private partnerships, and we can help you negotiate. However, because you're so risky as a continent on the African continent, you need to de-risk their investment in your continent. And so that means any policies or legislation that might be a barrier to their entry, you need to rework that. Great. And once you do, again, because you're so risky, you need to completely de-risk their investment. If anything happens, political strife, economic downturns, environmental hurricanes or whatever it may be, you need to de-risk this investment to ensure that their profits will be made despite what happens. Because as we all know, private sector are in it for the profit and not really to uphold a social contract between state and citizen. And this ties in with so many strings when we borrow money. It's tied into debt. It's tied into reaching targets for the SDG process, for the Africa 2063 process. It's all so insidiously enmeshed into each other. It's sort of hard to begin to see where our independent governments begin and where the World Bank ends in terms of where we're going from a developmental perspective. What it means for public-private partnerships as well is it questions what priorities our governments are choosing to invest in. If maternal health care isn't profitable, it's off the table. And it's off the table up against a mega infrastructure. Kenya has built a standard gauge rail, highly inefficient. It's about 7%. We're in debt about 7% of our GDP to finance this loan. Is it accessible to, farmers, smallholder farmer women across the country? No. But yet they will be the ones stuck with the debt of paying, and they pay this through, value-added tax for every spoon of sugar that they buy. They will be paying it. So in a sense, ostensibly, we are auctioning off our future generations. And you can see this again, that knowing that our percentage of private creditors is actually increasing through bonds and public-private partnerships. And I'll give Kenya as an example. $28 billion of our external debt is owed to private creditors, including holders of the country's 2 Eurobonds. And earlier this year, in the throes of COVID, our Ministry of Finance announced Kenya is taking a cautious approach to seeking debt relief from bilateral creditors to safeguard its sovereign credit rating. And so sovereign credit rating supersedes anything that we might be going through in terms of citizens and access to healthcare, education, emergency funds, and the rest. He said this is a clear sign how important private finance is and to what extent we're ready to sacrifice our citizens at the hands of the same private finance. If the economy isn't working, I then ask for our citizens. We question what this economy is for. And so I'll sort of begin to slow down and stop by saying I think there is hope, however, but the narrative must be ours and it must be told by us because it is our lives. And every time I look at, especially when I'm looking at work around financialization, for example, we're told as case studies of issues, but really our voices telling our narratives and the body of knowledge that is produced by us is really very little. We're used as case studies to attract funding for bigger organizations with very little space and funding directed to us to be able to tell our own stories, to analyze our own gaps and fight in the spaces that I spoke about. We must move away from narratives around individual interventions, which is, for so many years, we've been talked about livelihoods and 50 chicken projects and microfinance. And we really must work to changing this approach into more system work. And there's so many people that are doing that. There's so many great sisters on this call and beyond that are working together to influence not just global spaces, but also the seemingly progressive spaces on the continent that are fighting for economic justice and economic governance and the rights of our people and our women. The fight must go on. I think the work of the feminist futures is a shining light in the work that we must do in collaboration, in collective action, in collective thinking, and collaborating to create our own very Pan-African narrative that we can then go out and, burn it down. I'll stop there.
Womandla. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you so much. And I think thank you for that reminder as well. I mean, PPPs are extremely problematic. They often make a very small, minuscule contribution to state coffers, if at all. And as you rightly say, the risk and the de-risking is really a balance between what is and isn't profitable. And what a lot of people and a lot of citizens don't seem to realize is that our states actually subsidize hugely. And they're often as this kind of a cost sharing between states and private corporations. So it's not really a solution. And of course, where does this money come from? It comes from things like hospitals, like education, and. So the notion of what sovereignty actually means in relation to one's own state coffers becomes deeply contested. And this brings a stream, which I think even began with this morning when we were when Sylvia Tamali mentioned the whole notion of what colonial constructs keep manifesting. So thank you, Crystal, for that wonderful input. I would like to call next on Fatima Keller. Are you there, sister?
Hello, yes, I'm there. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Okay, so what a privilege it is to be included in this panel, and it's just been so wonderful listening to all of the interventions so far. But one of the challenges of being in such an amazing panel is, especially when you come on towards the end, a lot of the good stuff has already been said. And so what I'm gonna do is look along the lines of what I was going to speak about and try and maybe unpack some of those areas a little bit more and just go into a bit more detail around some of the broader concepts in terms of how we understand corporate power, and to touch on some of the areas that have already been discussed around trade liberalization and tax, but with a bit of a lens, particularly from the African perspective there as well. I think to start off with, it's very interesting when we talk about corporate power over states. It's really important to not just look at this as a Southern issue, so to speak. Actually, power over states in the global North is the starting point, and the political alignments in the global North of various private sector interests essentially cascade down to the rest of the world. And you need almost an investigative approach, really, to look into how the global North's democratic institutions, which often present themselves as clean and untouchable when it comes to corruption, nepotism, clientelism, actually court firms and private sector interests inherently. And this is actually part of the imperialist and colonialist framework that they themselves are inherently built on. And then that is exported through the larger institutions that global northern countries such as the IMF and World Bank have such a strong say in to the rest of us. And there is this inherent relationship between the IMF, and World Bank prescriptions, the shackles of debt, and trade liberalization, and the private sector interests that effectively push and gear all of those. Crystal has already spoken on public-private partnerships across the world, and particularly in the global South. In Africa, one of the things we need to actually do is quite a systemic mapping of what's happening in that space. It's really interesting because there's a lot of data and evidence now that shows that the narrative around private sector engagement through public-private partnerships, which is so heavily based on this idea of greater efficiency, is flawed. And there is a lot of evidence that's coming from the global North itself, and as a lot of established public sector institutions, public goods and services are being rolled back with the onslaught of public-private partnerships. There's an investigation into whether or not any of these are working. The UK has got some of the worst examples, but you can look to Australia, you can look to the US, you can look everywhere, and you'll see that they're denouncing it wholesale as they are exporting it wholesale to the rest of us. And we really need to get our hands on some of that and be able to actually demonstrate in those spaces where these discussions are being had and where we're being told that this is going to lead to greater efficiency, not to mention it will allow you to take some of the burden of fiscal responsibility off of your books by passing this on as a private sector project. Now, one area that hasn't been discussed so far, and I'll sort of speak on this a little bit, is the way in which the private sector is insidiously, and I'm borrowing Crystal's word here again, has made its way into the bilateral aid space. And there are lots of different ways that it does that. We know it does that through conditionalities and procurement in particular, but there's an entire area of bilateral programming called market systems programming, which some people may have heard of, but which I continuously find is very interesting that not as many people have heard of, because it operates almost completely independently in its own way. It's not delivered for the most part by international non-governmental organizations. It's often delivered by private consultancy firms, which will bid for these projects. They're worth millions and millions of pounds, so huge aid budgets, much bigger than what a lot of INGOs have. They were traditionally called markets for the poor. And I always smile when I say this. So some may know them better in this way. And what they do is they posit their justification for existing on the basis that they will open markets up for the poor and hit a bunch of development indicators on the back of that. So you will allow a farmer to be able to buy like a bag of fertilizer more easily by assisting a private sector company to essentially break that bag of fertilizer down into a smaller package so that a farmer can afford it. And so what you have is bilateral aid actually being used as an investment mechanism for private sector to further its profit interests. And the end result of these programs is purchase. Right? So they do have indicators that seem like development indicators. And a lot of these programs have happened in the agricultural space in particular. And there are a few that have been operating for decades, actually, in Nigeria under various different names. And they'll happen for 5 years and then be extended or reinvented after another 5 years. And the idea is that, you have, their reach targets are based on how many things are sold. And there's nothing shameful in this, right? So you've got development aid claiming to be lowering poverty on the basis that X number of farmers have been reached because they bought X product. And so you have here an unmasked private sector project, essentially, being delivered through UK aid or US aid or whichever aid program, whichever aid agency is delivering it. But at the same time, it's fundamentally creating multiple entry points for those very large corporations, because the largest corporations are the ones most able to respond to the needs of this program, entry points within that country to then dominate. So you'll find Syngenta, for example, within these programs. You'll find various subsidiaries of Monsanto within these programs, and any alternative indigenous private sector actors. And the programs claim to want to help indigenous private sector actors, and they will have a few here and there that they will also invest in. But these guys don't stand a chance against the corporate capacity of the much larger ones. And so this is an area that I think we need to spend more time looking at, because now recently they've started looking at market systems approaches for education and health. And there are 2 programs in Nigeria at the moment that are about to be rolled out in education and health that both have market systems components within them. And we know that the arguments around privatizing parts of education have been going on for some time now as a way of dealing with the fact that they haven't been able to meet the education MDGs, and health now has joined that. And so we need to have a lens on all of this in order to really be able to fundamentally challenge what's going on. The relationship between corporate power and liberalization, trade liberalization, has been looked at, but I wanted to just unpack this a little bit more as well. because I think it's quite interesting that, you know, we look at this issue of, you know, the term that's used is state, investor, you know, dispute resolution, right? So within regional and bilateral trade agreements in particular, these are built in. And what this effectively does more than anything is give the corporation the opportunity to take a state to court if it is disgruntled in some way. And often if it feels that its competitive edge has been undermined or there have been profit losses as a result. And it's the largest corporations that have the capacity to do this because they're in court for like 9-10 years. It costs a lot of money. And if a state does not win, I mean, the loss is enormous, which means that they're going to avoid trying to get to that place in the first place. And this is where the whole power issue comes in. So there needs to be a massive movement around ensuring that these bilateral agreements and regional agreements just do not have those components within them. But it's a huge ask, particularly as we're moving towards an age of bilateral agreements. We know, everybody knows the Brexit situation in the UK, and currently the UK government is rushing through a whole barrage of bilateral agreements that it wants to get done before it effectively leaves the UK in the new year, with very little consultation, zero consultation. What am I talking about? Kenya is one of those, Ghana is another. And, you know, who has sight of this? You know, what is the lens on all of this? Because at the moment, there is virtually no engagement around that issue. But I'm going to come to my last point now, and this really brings us a lot closer to home on the African continent, because it's not just external and regional bilateral, you know, trade agreements that we really need to be worried about. At the moment on the African continent, we have something called the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the biggest thing that's happening on the continent, arguably, and it will be, when it comes into effect, the largest free trade area in the world. There is a lot of excitement around this trade agreement on the continent. There's a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, because the idea is that it is based on a Pan-African principle of us essentially trading internally as a continent and therefore solidifying our borders and gaining a lot of internal strength that would then allow us to have a much greater power base when we engage with the EUs of the world and we engage in a bilateral trade agreement with Japan, for example, or South Korea, which are both also global northern countries, and we should not completely leave out of this equation. However, this paradigm is still fundamentally a neoliberal one. It's aiming to liberalize all goods and services up to 90% within 10 years for all countries that are not least developed, and for least developed countries, 13 years. And within that, several things will happen. The solicitation of FDI has already been touched on by Anita, and we know what therefore that will mean. We're looking at greater tax breaks because the investment needed to even get to a stage where you are able to compete within this trade agreement is going to be immense, particularly in our COVID times right now, with the shackles of debt that we currently have around our ankles. The other aspect of it, it is still fundamentally a neoliberal free trade agreement. You are asked to compete with your fellow African countries. They talk about a policy of cooperation, but there is no policy of solidarity mentioned anywhere within the agreement. And so what that then means is that our least developed countries are going to find themselves in the worst possible situation when these doors open. And that conversation, that political conversation about the extractive nature of trade liberalization is not being had at all. And actually women are being used as sort of, you know, the opportunities narrative within this. If you start looking at the literature coming out of UNECA, UN Women, the World Bank released a report in August talking about how women's wages will rise as a result of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But actually, when you look at it, we are completely unprepared for the onslaught that this kind of liberalization could potentially bring between our countries. And part of that is because we have not had a critical review of what this will also means in terms of corporations, because the key issue here is that the extra continental African transnational corporations on the continent are best placed to profit from this, hands down. And that conversation has not been had in any meaningful way from what I can see so far. And if it has been had, it has not permeated the spaces where the conversations are, or the decision makers currently are. And I think I've probably completely blown my time. So I'm going to stop there and just leave that as, I think, my leaving salvo, that the importance of also looking at some of what we consider to be our own internal projects, and who's pushing those projects. The EU wants the CFTA more than any other region from what I can see. We have to ask ourselves why that is. You know, there's a reason for that. What further imperialist extractive benefits will the CFTA in its current format? Yeah, this is not an anti-integrationist perspective. This is just looking at the CFTA in its current format. What will that mean, and what is its relationship with corporate power? We have to ask that question more critically now than ever.
Thanks, Fatima. Sure. So, yeah, quite a few salvos there. I think around especially the dangers of bilateralism versus, and the way in which they actually disrupt oftentimes quite useful regional blocs and pit countries off against each other, as you rightly say. We saw this with the economic partnership agreements, which some of us spent our youth trying to fight, and well, here we are. And also, of course, the state-investor dispute resolutions, and the notion that, again, corporates are more important than states, and often can usurp state sovereignty if they're big enough and have enough financial muscle behind them. But I think also the concerns around the AFCTA, which I think are really well made, because again, a neoliberal reproduction of a northern paradigm of doing business, and a very business model. And I'm excited that you said that, because I think a few of us have felt like lone voices that were not really excited and waving our dashikis around because of this wonderful Africa-wide agreement that is supposed to take us all out of poverty and create blue skies for the whole continent. So thank you so much for that, Fatima. And I'd love to turn this to Flora to take it away.
Yes, thank you very much for your invitation. Can you hear me? Yes?
Very clearly.
I speak in Spanish now, and I take a little bit time to the translators. Muchas gracias. Estoy feliz de ver a amigas de la lucha, queridas, que hace muchos meses que no nos vemos, así que quiero abrazarlas y me da mucha alegría porque son compañeras de la lucha con las cuales aprendí mucho y aprendemos en cada uno de estos encuentros. Y saludos y felicitaciones para quienes organizan el festival, la querida Nancy, Leo Bohan, Nilanjana, Ale, bueno, tantas compañeras queridas que estuvieron organizando esto en pandemia. Coincido en la sintonía del análisis que mis compañeras que me precedieron venían compartiendo en esta idea de analizar las narrativas de este capitalismo extractivo de recursos naturales, de lo público, del vaciamiento de lo público y lo común, y también extractivos de los datos, ¿no? Si hay algo que hemos visto en este contexto de la pandemia del COVID-19, ha sido cómo hay grandes corporaciones ganadoras, corporaciones inteligentes, como le gusta llamarlas a Anita Gurumurti, que viene trabajando fuertemente el tema de la justicia digital. Y los datos que ella nos compartía en una reunión anterior que tuvimos es que justamente las 5 compañías digitales más importantes del mundo han concentrado el 18% de la capitalización del mercado, con una rapidez y un nivel de concentración fabuloso. Y lo más preocupante de este dato es que estas compañías, y en pandemia mucho más, ¿no? Durante el lockdown, justamente garantizan la infraestructura que permite los intercambios sociales, comerciales, financieros. Entonces, cuando hablamos de poder corporativo y cuando hablamos de esta presencia de estas empresas multinacionales, quería referir mi intervención en el tiempo que tengo a las cuestiones de las condiciones laborales y al impacto que tiene en nuestras condiciones de trabajo como mujeres, como lesbianas, como trans, travestis y no binarias. Y por eso es que creo que uno de los mayores desafíos, y creo que desde los feminismos podemos hacerlo, es cómo desafiamos, como decía Ana Belenda, este poder corporativo, y en ese desafío, ¿qué contranarrativas vamos a construir frente a estas narrativas dominantes de las empresas? En particular, a las que se han concentrado en el e-commerce y en la economía digital. Porque creo que estas empresas, sobre todo aquellas que se enmarcan en el gran modelo de negocios de Amazon, en América Latina, desde donde les hablo, en Buenos Aires, en el Sudamérica, hay una empresa homónima, un marketplace homónimo que se llama Mercado Libre, muy similar al modelo de negocios de Amazon, que ha creado un ecosistema que durante la pandemia ha triplicado sus ganancias. Son las llamadas empresas unicornio, son esas empresas que han concentrado intercambios comerciales, financieros, logística, y que han pulverizado las relaciones laborales, han pulverizado los derechos laborales, justamente con un modo de comercio y un modelo de negocios que las hace aparecer como meras intermediarias. Ellas son intermediarias entre consumidores y productores, pero no aparecen con responsabilidades laborales. Y esto es un problema, y creo que es uno de los grandes problemas de la economía digital. Entonces, quisiera referirme a las disputas que tenemos frente a esto, que no es solamente por las narrativas, por los discursos, sino también disputas materiales, que son los impactos directos sobre el mercado laboral y sobre los empleos generados por estas plataformas. ¿Por qué nos preocupan las narrativas que manejan? Porque, por un lado, hay una voraz apropiación por parte del poder corporativo sobre palabras que han sido muy caras y muy valiosas al movimiento feminista, pero también al movimiento de trabajadoras y trabajadores, a la organización sindical. Por ejemplo, estas empresas de plataformas hablan de libertad, hablan de una supuesta economía colaborativa, hablan también de la flexibilidad, pero en un tono positivo. Puedes ser tu propia jefa, puedes manejar tus horarios, cuando sabemos que esa narrativa esconde justamente modos precarios de trabajo. Y esto nos preocupa porque justamente estas empresas no aparecen como responsables de sus obligaciones laborales, fiscales, tributarias, y sobre todo, una de las que más me preocupa, pensando en la situación global, es cómo esto impacta sobre el sistema de seguridad social y sobre cuestiones de protección social básicas. En estos modelos de negocios que se impulsan a partir de estas empresas de plataformas, también aparecen los discursos sobre la inclusión financiera y esos discursos que Cristal mencionaba sobre salidas individuales y exitosas, que justamente lo que vemos es que no son las salidas, justamente son salidas que apuestan al emprendedurismo, salidas que apuestan a el crédito a los pequeños y comerciantes, y que empiezan a interactuar en este ecosistema sin ningún tipo de regulaciones, porque justamente los estados se les escapan de las manos las regulaciones del e-commerce. Entonces esto es altamente preocupante. Y también otra cuestión que nos preocupa en términos de las narrativas tiene que ver con que estas empresas comienzan a manejar narrativas con un efecto de greenwashing, de social washing, de feminist washing, y lo que más nos preocupa es que vacían políticamente de sentido y de la potencia política que tiene el feminismo justamente con estas formas de reapropiación. Y me parece que hay una alianza aquí muy poderosa que estas empresas logran, que es comenzar a presentarse como sustentables, como sostenibles. El marketplace del cual les hablaba al inicio, que es Mercado Libre, que es una empresa muy poderosa en América Latina, está presente en 20 países y es similar a Amazon, pero más pequeña, dice que ella tiene un triple impacto positivo. El primero es social, porque conecta a los usuarios, cuando en verdad en esa plataforma hay trabajadores no reconocidos como tal. Tiene un impacto ambiental, porque como es liviana, tiene códigos éticos, no genera contaminación, se puede mover por la vía digital sin generar impactos ambientales, cuando sabemos que también el comercio electrónico y este modelo de negocios tiene impactos concretos. Y que, por supuesto, el tercer impacto es la generación de valor económico. Entonces, esta reapropiación también viene asociada con procesos de endeudamiento. Estos modelos de negocios, estos marketplaces, son creadores de nuevas formas de endeudamiento de las mujeres, porque son habilitadores de crédito, por fuera de los bancos privados. Aquí hay todo un circuito financiero que se mueve por fuera de los bancos, por fuera de la regulación estatal. Entonces, en este sentido, y para ir cerrando la intervención, pensaba que estos desafíos frente a esta reapropiación de las narrativas y como feministas de poder construir otras contranarrativas, tenemos que prestar mucha atención a estas empresas multinacionales, creadoras de estas plataformas digitales, que lo que han hecho, y sobre todo en pandemia, es concentrar aún más la riqueza, pulverizar las relaciones laborales, reforzar la división internacional, sexual y racial del trabajo. Han sido quienes han generado oportunidades de ingreso para fuerza de trabajo migrante, principalmente en las plataformas de servicios, de delivery y de ciertos servicios como los cuidados. Han puesto más en evidencia la crisis de los cuidados, y para aquellas oportunidades de empleo que están en los hogares, por ejemplo, las ventas online, donde las mujeres justamente encuentran una posibilidad, esto ha realizado una vuelta a lo doméstico. Las formas de empleo remoto, el reforzamiento del teletrabajo, ha generado justamente una vuelta a lo doméstico y puesto más en crisis la organización de los cuidados. Entonces, frente a esto, la pregunta que les dejo aquí es cómo desde los feminismos podemos construir contranarrativas, cómo reforzamos nuestros internacionalismos, cómo construimos coaliciones con estos movimientos y organizaciones de trabajadoras y trabajadores precarios que justamente están bajo estas condiciones de plataformas y que ya se están viendo los efectos, ¿no? El ejemplo de los riders, que son quienes reparten en las ciudades cuando estábamos en plena cuarentena, es por poner solo un ejemplo. Y cómo los feminismos, desde los feminismos, contribuimos a crear justamente esa otra economía que es la respuesta frente al poder corporativo. Cómo los feminismos están tejiendo y tramando en la construcción de otra economía posible, que por ejemplo genere economía social y solidaria, cooperativa, que se meta de lleno en la arena de las finanzas éticas y en un terreno que es muy árido aún, que es el de las energías sostenibles. Muchas gracias y les dejo un abrazo enorme y fuerte a todas.
And a big hug back at you. Thank you for your feminist fire, Flora, and thank you for again reminding us about the misappropriation of terms and what I think what many of us are calling the precariat, right? The working precariat, which has only been reinforced through COVID, many of us working from home, and this blur between the private life and the working life, which is actually now becoming a false dichotomy, much more online activity and a much greater investment in digital economics, even though it's one of the most undemocratic spaces that we can think of. I try very hard to stay off of Amazon because I have no interest in making that man, giving that man one more red cent of my hard-earned money, but it's almost difficult to avoid, right? So Netflix and Amazon. So what did we do when we were spending more time at home? Watched more Netflix, ordered more Uber Eats, more Mr. Delivery, and ordered more books. How ironic that we all feed into this really awful machine. And then, of course, fourth industrial revolution, the great frontier, the new colonial power, actually. So I see people like, your Zuckerbergs and all of these, your Amazons and the scenarios that you mentioned, Flora, they're no better than Vasco da Gama, than Christopher Columbus, and a new form of digital colonialism, indeed. So thank you so much for all of those insights. I'm gonna just go through a few questions because time truly does fly when you're having this much fun. It's just not fair. I'm going in the last 10 minutes that we have, I'll pose, I think there are 3 questions or so, and if by any chance I've missed them, the organizers will assist. There's one from Nancy, which says, what are we supposed to do in the face of such disproportionate corporate power? And if the current trends continue, where will we be in 10 years? There's another question from, Sipokazi, nice to see you. Thank you to panelists. Fatima, I share your fears about the ACFTA, yeah, whatever, that thing. While African countries have jumped at the trade agreement, they're not showing the same enthusiasm about the protocol on the movement of people, movement of persons. There's this implicit assumption that African economic integration can be achieved without Africans. Well, there you go. Can genuine transformative African integration happen without the free movement of Africans in Africa? And I think the same could be said, can it happen without the free movement of Asians in Asia, Latin Americans in Latin America, and so on and so forth? There's also another question much earlier on, which I'm sorry I don't get your name, but I do remember the question, which was that there's a great emphasis across the presentations around the West. So, the Washington consensus, the Wall Street consensus, as Crystal said, Western-based hegemonies. What about the East? And by the East, I'm assuming that the asker is perhaps referring to China, because that's become like the proxy for the East. So in no particular order, if any of us would like to take a bite as we, give our final remarks, sadly for us, our final remarks, at any piece of that, please do. So I could do it in reverse order again. So Anna, let's hear from you.
Definitely. I think I will answer this one in English, just to respond a little bit to what others have said. And I think Nancy's question, I think, is great because it challenges us in terms of, what is the solution, what should we do in this context. I think here I want to bring in something that we call in AWID 3 Ds. We call it dismantle, disrupt, and delegitimize corporate power in particular. And I think within those 3 fronts, I think feminist movements have been moving quite fast and in alliances with other social movements in particular. So in terms of dismantle, I think there's a great amount of work being done in terms of knowledge of unpacking what corporate power even means and how does it translate into our daily lives, into our daily work? How does it intersect with other feminist movement struggles, including those around bodily and pleasure and so on, that seem so disconnected to what the economy means? I think that's a huge area. Another example around disrupting, I think, is this work of not normalizing corporate power in different fora in which women's rights organizations are part of and should be front and center at the table. And I mean, for example, all of the Beijing +25 celebrations and the action coalitions, for example, there is a presence there of the corporate sector as problematic, and that women's rights organizations have been very vocal in saying why this is problematic. And I think we need to be in those spaces precisely to disrupt, to not normalize corporate power in those spaces. And the third, which is to delegitimize, I think has to do with that narrative, that neoliberal narrative of who are the experts to talk about the economy. I mean, even within our governments, at least in Latin America, it happens a lot, this revolving door phenomenon in which a right-wing conservative government comes in and, the experts to lead the ministries of food and agriculture are members of Monsanto, of Cargill, those that are leading, telecommunications are, from the big tech companies. And I think that narrative needs to be delegitimized. That idea of we're not the experts, the private sector is the ones that are effective and great. And I think that's another big battle that we also have to have in our local and global lives as well. Stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Appreciate that. Absolutely. We do need to delegitimize that language. I think Anita was struggling a bit with her connectivity. So sadly, I think we have lost her in terms of final remarks, but appreciating her in absentia. I'll jump to Crystal in alphabetical order, seconds.
Yeah, wow, I don't even know where to start. I think I really liked what Anna presented on the 3Ds, a dismantle, disrupt, and delegitimize. And I think for me, the biggest thing that comes up is narrative. And this has been spoken about by all of us. Flora put it really eloquently. When our language is taken from us and suddenly you've got the World Bank using the same exact language as we use, but in terms of what they're saying, it's sort of like, wait, what is this disconnect? So I think the softer issues around narrative, language, words, and against a backdrop that all oppression is linked, but at the same time, how can we collectivize across different fights? How do we bring in more of the poets, filmmakers, musicians, all of that to begin to delegitimize, like Anna says, a narrative that continues to grow. I'm always in sort of awe in a strange way of America and their film and Hollywood industry that paints this, very America is a great nation and the land of the free. It's really not, but it really just like brainwashes everybody, including us, that we, young teenagers are like, wow. So how do we take the same sort of lessons from that and really delegitimize and completely, bring down these bastions of power? And I think I question ourselves sometimes and what our role is in creating gatekeeping, spaces where we speak a certain jargon and not everybody can engage in certain narratives. And how do we make sure that we're not continuing to do that, and we're bringing in different spaces, different communities, different collectives to fight with us? The question on China is a really interesting one, because I know it's kind of the elephant in the room. With, Kenya has SGR built by the Chinese. We've got a whole Confucius department at the University of Nairobi. The presence of China is very heavily felt. But it's sort of the narrative again around China is that, well, there's no strings attached, like when we get money from the West. And so it's just easier to do just basic business with them. But, the quota of debt that we accrue from China is increasing. They had an extraordinary Africa-China summit this year, while the EU-Africa summit was still trying to figure out if it was going to happen or not. And China did speak about debt relief, but they stayed away from speaking about multilateral debt relief and have spoken about having individual conversations and negotiations with individual countries. And that the silence on, a multilateral debt relief is very worrying. And their silence on, what exactly are we talking about when they just announced that, there will be debt relief. In 2015, for example, 70% of the $60 billion China pledged to Africa was concessional loans. It was credit lines, and African small and mid-sized enterprise loans with zero interest government loans accounted for only 9%. And so it's a huge, and I agree, it's a huge area that we need to look at. And I really hope there's more African feminists that can begin to do the analysis there.
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, absolutely. It's a big ask, but we're big doers as well. Fatima, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay.
Salvo.
A salvo. Okay, so I will go straight to the question on the CFTA. And yeah, I completely agree. The number of countries that have signed the protocol on the free movement of persons is far fewer because they are more afraid of what it means. And so what we have is a situation here where, you know, effectively they want to see the free movement of goods and services, but we all have to stay in our holes. Thank you very much. And this is immensely problematic because that completely goes against the very idea of the Pan-Africanism which they claim that the CFTA is essentially promoting, and even to a certain extent the Abuja Treaty that the trade agreement references quite a few times. I think what we also need to be worried about, however, is the way in which that protocol is used to move people in the service of trade, because there could be a scenario where, you know, very targeted movement of persons is brought in to the process, whether you're looking at particular skills. This could lead to a variety of different things, brain drains from one country to another, as you see, you know, certain professionals from health and education sectors effectively being targeted and solicited across the continent, and more countries suffering on the back of that. But then the biggest worry for me, to be honest with you, is having a similar situation to what they have in the EU, where actually, you know, workers' wages are driven down as the working classes across the continent are put into a scenario where they're competing with one another for work as they move around the continent. And that's because currently there is no harmonized approach whatsoever to labor rights as part of this agreement. Of course, why would there be? And so all of that is at the discretion of the individual country. And there is reference to special economic arrangements within the agreement, which is basically code for special economic zones, which we already have in Africa, but this could mean to a mushrooming across the continent where we know labor rights are completely absent. And therefore, the free movement of persons is something that really needs to be unpacked and understood how that could be exploited. And so it's not just a case of the absence of it, it's also how it could be exploited at some point in the future. And I think we need to look at that seriously.
Thanks, Fatima. And Flora, you get the final word.
Sí, creo que hemos hablado mucho de economía y la pregunta de Nancy nos lleva a pensarnos en 10 años. Entonces, creo que también esto es una pregunta por la construcción política, el proyecto político del feminismo, de los feminismos, de esta hermandad desde el sur que estamos construyendo en espacios como este festival y como justamente lo que implica entender en clave sur-sur. Y creo que la salida a esta nueva normalidad en disputa, se habla y los gobiernos están hablando de esta nueva normalidad, y yo creo que esta nueva normalidad está totalmente en disputa porque justamente hay fuerzas y poderes reales tratando de llevarnos a esa normalidad que ya sabíamos que estaba todo mal, ¿no? Era extractiva, precaria. Entonces, creo que si la salida son los feminismos, debemos llegar a construir en estos 10 años una fortaleza entre los movimientos en clave internacionalista que pueda justamente plantear una salida feminista a la crisis multidimensional en la que estamos, ¿no? Una crisis sanitaria, económica, social, y esta salida de la pandemia justamente está evidenciando todo lo que ya desde la economía feminista se venía diciendo. Entonces, construyamos esa salida juntas, y creo que espacios como este son lo valioso de poder encontrarnos, escucharnos y generar saberes también. Así que vamos por esa salida.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, all good things do come to an end. And I'm going to salute you all in the language of my heritage. Kia lelewa kau fela ka bunana bahau. Kia lewa ka le rato la luna. Kia lewa hawaneng na litsibo libasadi tota limanaka itlile lidipoho. In brief, that just means you're fierce and you rock in Sesotho. So thank you all. And a good evening to everybody. So please stay tuned, everybody else, for tomorrow. Check out southfeministfuturesfestival.org to find out what else is happening. We start at 7 a.m. South African time, 5 a.m. UCT. So please tune in. It's a whole day festival, a whole week festival. What a fantastic way to end a horrible year, and what a precursor to a fantastic Christmas. Ciao. Ya leboha. Seabonga. Good evening. Gracias.